Deciding on the right time for repotting Sobralia can be a little bit daunting sometimes. They don't really have any large pseudobulbs that are going to help store enough energy to help them recover from transplant. So knowing when to do the repot or the division of your Sobralia is very important. Let's get straight into it. This is Sobralia mirabilis. It is a hybrid, a primary hybrid of Sobralia macrantha and Sobralia veitchii. Although veitchii is also a hybrid itself, but this is still considered a primary hybrid. They're a little bit more dwarf than what your macrantha are, so it makes them easier to handle. Also, if you're looking for one that's going to be indoors, this is probably going to be an easier bet to manage as well than having those 1.2, 1.5 or even taller Sobralias in your home. But remember, being terrestrial orchids, they're not always terribly well suited for growing indoors. You generally always get a better plant if you are able to grow it outdoors. And these are extremely forgiving plants. They have a wide range of temperatures and humidities that they can grow in. But one thing they do like is lots and lots of light, especially if you want all those beautiful flowers. These Sobralia mirabilis can take temperatures anywhere from around 5 or 6 degrees Celsius all the way up to 32 degrees. And that's approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit up to about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So temperature for them is not going to be a problem. They do also like to get a bit of temperature fluctuation between day and night temperatures. So that makes them especially well suited for, say, those Mediterranean type climates, where in winter you get nice cool temperatures and in summer you get boiling hot. These Sobralias do extremely well. Their home ranges from Mexico all the way down into Bolivia, and this means that with the broad range of habitats that they come from, make them quite adaptable plants. Their preferred humidity range is from about 50 to 70%, so which makes it very possible to actually still grow them in the home. But remember, they do like lots and lots of air movement. With all these fine leaves stacked together in a pot like this, if the air goes stagnant, they're going to rot quite quickly. So ensure that there's always good air movement through it. So even if you've got a fan almost directly blowing onto it, that will be ideal. Of course, not hard enough to blow it over, but they do like that good air movement. That's why they particularly do well outdoors. And when is the best time to repot them? Well, generally they spring to summer flowering plants. So often the best time to repot is after flowering, which is generally often towards autumn. So autumn can be a relatively good period to repot your orchids. Remember, you want to see that new growth happening from the bottom. You want to see those new shoots just starting to come up. That means there's going to be new root volume that's starting to grow. These Sobralias don't have a winter dormancy. They do slow down their growth during colder periods, but they don't go completely dormant like other orchids, such as your catasedums and even some of those cymbidiums. Repotting in autumn, as those new roots start growing, is going to be ideal. It's going to help those roots acclimatize to the new situation quickly, and it will help the plant recover faster. And if you miss your autumn repotting, then the best bet is to repot in spring. You want to get in just as active growth is really ramping up, and that way it can also settle in faster. So remember, either that after flowering or in early spring. Often the bud sets will start in that autumn period. So if you can get in immediately after the previous flowering is finished and allow it to settle down so that those buds can start forming during that autumn period, so that they can be available for spring and summer flowering. Depending on the media that you grow them in, because that's also the wonderful thing about these Sobralias, is they'll almost grow in any media as long as it's well drained. So even if you're using just plain bark, or if you are using a soil-based media like I like to use for mine, because they are terrestrial orchids, well, a lot of them are terrestrial orchids. So with my mirabilis, I like to use a soil-based media, but we'll get to that as we're repotting. And as I was saying, repotting, you may actually only need to do every 3 or 4 years, depending on the media that you're using and how decomposed it becomes and how much moisture it retains. They do need that drainage. Even though they like to stay moist all year round, they still need good drainage. or you will rot the roots. So the difficult part with these is always you've just waited for these new shoots to come, and now you have to fiddle with the plant. So we've got to be careful that we don't break these new shoots off. Also, I generally only repot when my pots have really become overgrown, that the roots start either shooting out the bottom of the pots or that they start pushing out over the top. It's because I like nice, large, showy plants. But theoretically, depending on the media, again, between 2 and 4 years is generally safest. That way you're not going to have as much of a problem with repotting as I'm going to have here. So we're going to have a big tangled root mess with so let's just bang around the side to try and loosen it up. With some of these Sobralias, especially with Sobralia mirabilis, they're actually relatively fast growing. So although they do well in tight pots, as you can see, you don't want them necessarily to overgrow the pot too quickly. So I often put mine in slightly bigger pots than what may initially be thought of as the right size pot. Although if you are doing smaller divisions, then of course go to a smaller pot and allow that pot to fill up with roots before transplanting that into a bigger pot. But also remember, with these having such fine, thin, reed-like pseudobulbs, they don't like to be divided into small pieces because there's not that much reserve energy for them to keep growing if you divide them into really small pieces. So the best bet is always to look at between 6 and 12 of these canes per division, and also try and make sure that there's a new eye coming up or that new growth. That way you can be sure that your plant is then going to settle in. Always be careful, we don't want to break all those pseudocanes. And look at all that root volume. So we can see at the bottom of these roots here how nice and fresh this new root growth is. But we are going to have to get in here somehow to be able to divide this up so that we can repot it. We could always just go for a larger size pot and put the whole thing in, but still we have to open out this root volume here to get out this old media. If you haven't been using a soil-based media, you really want to get that media out. If you're using a soil-based media, often you could if you've planted in a big enough pot, you can actually let it keep growing in that almost indefinitely, as long as you keep feeding your media. But of course, you're going to be feeding your orchids anyway. And talking about feeding, they're quite heavy feeders during that growth phase. So, well, the major growth phase, that's spring and summer, they really want to be fed well. So you're going to be giving them a lot of food during that period. That doesn't mean go overfeeding, don't go super concentrated. Do your normal feeding regime, but feed every week. Okay. Now this is one of the reasons I'm not allowed in the garage anymore. Pull out a screwdriver. Try force through some holes. Just also remember with Sobralia, their root volume is so important. It's incredibly important to them to have good root volume because they don't have much of a pseudobulb, as I said before. So they're going to need those roots that have stored some energy and that are going to be able to absorb more energy for them. So try and avoid as much root damage as possible. That's one of the ways a lot of people will go wrong with their Sobralias, is they'll treat them as if they're Cymbidiums and go through and cut off the majority of the root volume. and then wonder why their plant dies. Your plant will recover so much faster if you are leaving between 6 and 12 of those canes, and if those have some good root volume on them, you probably won't have a problem at all. Try and maintain your root volume, and you're not going to have the same sort of problem with the dying of your root volume that you've left on your plant, because they're not as fussy as epiphytic orchids are, because you're planting them in a similar sort of medium. Again, they're going to react more like your pot plant would as you're putting their roots back into a thick media. A thick media? Am I thick? Let's wonder. So we're going to have to go in through the bottom of the pot now. So if you see, I go in at sort of like a 45-degree angle and then straighten it up a bit to try and loosen out the roots. I don't go forcing all the way. I try and, if they start giving too much resistance, then I know it's still a live root, and then I try and avoid pulling any harder on it. So it's just to slowly loosen up the root volume so I can really get in there. This is always going to be a slow process because, as I said, we don't want to go in through there and smashing up the root volume. And then you can slowly pry the roots around the outside loose. Just going to make it easier to get on the inside without trying to damage too many of these. And remember, this is a game of patience. As soon as you start getting impatient, you start causing troubles, you're going to damage your roots, and your plant is going to take longer to recover, or it may not recover at all. And once you've sort of started to make your way into the center of the pot itself, slowly working your way through, loosening up these roots as you go, you want to work towards a point where the plant is a little bit more open, as opposed to these two sides here where you can see masses of growth. So if we can get our opening in through to that center, that's where it's going to break apart more easily, because that's obviously the older part of the plant, and that's where it's allowing us to get in for one, so that we can just divide this plant in half. In the center of the pot is where the roots are probably most likely going to be the most rotten, so those you don't have to be so careful of, because that's where the pot gets, or the initial root growth happens, is in the middle, and you start getting limited air movement, limited space, too much water, all of those sorts of things happening. That's why invariably your orchid will then start putting its roots around the side of the pot to get more air and allow for the water to drain past the roots quicker, instead of being all soggy in the middle. So in the middle is generally where those older, deader roots are. So those you can just, once you've loosened up those side roots, is you can just get in and try and loosen those away. You'll probably be breaking through a lot of them, but that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Most of those will probably be dead. Okay, there we go, starting to come apart. So doing it this way, you're probably going to get a lot more of a natural divide of your plant than if you go in with cutters and cut through, because then you may cut through multiple different rhizomes. Whereas by pulling it apart, generally you'll end up pulling apart the parts where it's going to be the weakest, and that's generally the older growths, and that will just allow you to have more natural pieces, if you want to call it that, of your orchid left. It's also easier now to get in, and we can see there's actually not that much media left, because there was a majority of soil-based media that it really doesn't need to be removed. We could always go through, wash this out, give it a good rinse and start from the beginning, but then I am going to damage these roots some more. Whereas even with a big piece like this, I just really don't want to damage too much of the roots. I'll go in with some sanitized secateurs, cutting out any of those old pseudobulbs. You don't really have to do this at this point. You can allow them to die off and pull out naturally, but also it helps reduce any chance of the ingress of any fungi or bacteria at this point. We can go through and cinnamize, put cinnamon onto any of these open wounds that we find here, just to ensure that we're not getting any further fungal infections or bacteria into this plant. And then what you can do is just go through, remove any of the rotting or old roots just by plucking them out. Now this smaller subdivision here, I'm going to be putting back into the same pot that I had originally removed it from. And what media do I like to use? I use a very well draining media. I use silica sand, which is basically the sand that you use in your pool filters. You know that's going to drain well. It's not going to really hold much moisture at all. It's just going to allow for air movement and moisture running straight through. Because they're heavy feeders and where they grow in their natural habitat, I'm going to be using compost. Not even just a potting soil, just pure compost. And because compost generally has a pH of between 7 and 8, or 6 and 8 I think it is, so you can never be too sure unless you use a pH meter on your compost. Also, silica sand's got a pH of 7, so now I need something that's going to bring the pH down, because as with most orchids, our Sobralias like a pH of around 5.5 to 6.5, so I'm going to have to try and manage my pH using these sort of almost more neutral media. So what I'm going to use is, this is pine bark shavings. This is basically the junk that's left over from the bottom of your pine bark bags and things like that. It's just the leftover junk that you would usually just throw into your compost heap or out into the garden. So this makes it really inexpensive. You can just use your normal pine bark chips or anything like that, because pine bark does have an acidic nature to it. And also, as it slowly decomposes, it reduces, it becomes more acidic. So that's actually what we want. This will bring the pH of our media down to suit our orchid. And basically what I'm going to be doing is doing a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It's a really simple, easy mix. Nothing special or fancy about it. So it's basically going to be 1 part silica sand, 1 part compost, and 1 part bark. So that silica sand is going to allow for the drainage, and that bark is going to help hold a little bit of moisture so that these don't dry out too quickly. So it's going to be an ideal mix for your Sobralia, especially Sobralia macrantha. I find does particularly well in this mix, and we can see how well that had grown. Also, me saying that I like to put mine into slightly bigger pots, what you do have to take note of putting it in a big pot is you've got to be careful that your big pot isn't going to hold too much moisture. You've got to make sure that it's still going to drain well. And so if you've got a big tall pot, you're going to have to either fill the bottom with bricks or with large bark chunks or something to make sure that you've got air movement and excellent drainage there. And you can use something then to separate your media that you put on top, because these, although they do have such a big root system, it's not necessarily going to go all the way down to the bottom of a big tall pot. Even when we were growing ours in our large standing pots, I used to put those big chunks of landscape bark at the bottom. I'd fill the pot basically halfway with that, use a little bit of shade cloth or netting above that, and then fill up the media on top. So remember, when repotting and dividing your Sobralias, the important part is your root volume and your rhizomes. We don't want to damage those terribly much. We need as much of that as possible so that we can keep the top growth happy while the bottom is recovering. And remember, don't over compact your media. You want to make sure it's nice and fluffy and light, that the moisture is going to drain through. Remember, these are going to want to stay moist even during those winter periods where their growth has slowed down, but remember, they don't go through dormancy, so they don't want to go completely dry. If they do dry, they lose their leaves incredibly quickly. You can notice within 2 days of drying, their leaves can already start to brown and die off. So with the leaves being so thin, you can lose a lot of leaf volume really quickly. And there we go. Problem with fiddling with your plants at this time, or how all those new shoots are growing. Obviously, they're still young and easily broken. And there we go, our Sobralia potted into 2 sections. We can see how long it's taken already. The sun's come down and it's glaring in my eyes. I hope you can see my eyes are open looking at you. But it's not such a daunting task after all. We just have to be aware of those few things, especially since that we know there's not that much stored energy in these plants. The stored energy is in the roots, in the rhizomes, and a little bit in those pseudobulbs that are just thin little canes. So we have to take care to do it at the right time. And remember, even though they are such sun-loving plants, these Sobralia mirabilis, I've got out here on my deck, out in the full sun all day long, and this is what they look like. But I will take them out of the sun to let them acclimatize for about a month. I'll give them a little bit of extra shade just so that they not put under too much stress while they recover. A lot of people may only prefer to keep these in morning sun and then the rest of the day a little bit of dapple shade, or otherwise give them that morning and afternoon sun with shade during midday to protect them a bit from the heat, because their leaves are quite thin and you can get burn spots on them. Although mine are so acclimatized to the full sun here that they just do quite fine. I am going to be giving these a good watering now. Unlike with some of my other orchids that I don't water after repotting, with these, well, with most of my terrestrial orchids, I do water in. It's to allow the sand and all the media to settle in between the roots, to knock out those large air pockets, to fill that all up, to allow the sand to move into place, so that the orchid then becomes settled more quickly. Also with my Sobralias, I'm never going to let them dry out, not even in the cool winters. As I said, they do manage to temperatures down to 6 degrees quite easily. Frost will damage them, but we're lucky we don't have frost here, although we do get those cold evenings in winter. But they don't mind it at all. And I do still keep watering them, although that does provide a little bit of evaporative cooling on them, but they really don't mind. They'd rather stay moist than dry out and die. Also remember, with that staying moist, you've got to give them that air movement. No air movement with all that moisture that they like will cause rot. So it's kind of a fine balance, but nothing that's not unachievable, because these are really such forgiving plants. And if you need any more information on other terrestrial orchids or other orchids in general, Ed posts up a lot of information down in that Buy Me a Coffee link there that is available to everyone. So go have a look, and if you feel like it, sign up, become a member, and grow like a pro. And thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.